I'm Robert Mailing with the Sioux Empire Podcast, and I'm here with Dr. Robert McTaggart, Professor of Physics from SDSU. You reached out to us after our most recent episode where we talked a little bit about radioactive South Dakota, kind of a scary, jumpy headline there, but getting into the details a little bit, what we were talking about was the borehole testing that they are talking about doing.
I don't think that they've done any particular borehole drilling with this particular study in mind. I think there are boreholes that have been drilled for other purposes, for geology or oil and gas or something else, or water. But not this deep.
Okay. People hear radiation and radioactive waste, and it's, a very scary, intimidating topic that a lot of people don't know that much about, and basically have, pop culture references to go on as their, anchor there. What is the plan with this study? Is it basically to see if they can find a long-term site for disposing of this? Can you give us a little more detail on that?
I think that's one option. If you talk to the guys, they will tell you also that the geothermal energy is also a possible use of this technology, and you could probably think of carbon capture too. If you have a liquefied carbon product that you could put down there.
Sure.
But definitely, the primary use of this design would be consideration for some type of nuclear waste disposal, and then there are different kinds of and forms of nuclear waste. In principle, this would be what I would call defense waste. So these are the wastes that were produced during the production of nuclear weapons.
Forgive me if I'm incorrect on this, but doesn't the weapon waste tend to be more radioactive than the standard waste from a plant?
It tends to be because it has a shorter half-life.
Okay.
So the more often you have a radioactive process occur, the more particles it sends out per unit time. And so you have to be more careful with it.
Sure. And so really what they're talking about is studying the possibility. No one has talked about actually moving any waste here.
Correct. But I think opponents have jumped the gun a little bit in that regard. And, the argument is, if it's so great for this test, why wouldn't it be great for future permanent storage? And there are probably lots of issues with that. They're being pretty careful about trying to obtain consent of the public. And so technically for a drill project, they don't have to, but they're trying to do that. But if they were to actually consider bringing in nuclear waste into the state, there'd be a whole another level of investigation and public outreach and state government interest. And, so this is tame by comparison with what would happen if we were actually to consider nuclear waste disposal here.
Sure. So at this point, they're just researching the borehole technology itself. They're not even handling anything like radioactive waste.
Correct. Basically, if you want to isolate nuclear material from the biosphere, you need to understand how access to water and oxygen at those depths occur. And so basically, they're going to drill down and they're going to look for, microfractures and look for movement of water at very slow rates within the rock if it moves at all. And, further borehole drillings will have to be done. This isn't the only test that they will have to do.
Sure.
And that could likely occur at other locations. So I think the primary purpose of this particular test, and there are 4 sites under consideration. So it's not just South Dakota; it's a couple in New Mexico. I think another one in Texas. I forget if it's 2 in Texas and 1 in New Mexico, or 2 in New Mexico and 1 in Texas. But there are 3 other than South Dakota.
So is the hope of the study, is it that they're looking to see that? Are they looking for a big salt deposit where they're sure that the material wouldn't move for millions of years? Is that kind of the idea here?
That's one approach to one kind of waste.
Okay.
So if you're talking about waste from power plant, definitely, I think from what I understand, that salts are a better material.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that you can't do engineering to make whatever material you have the best that it can be, with defense in-depth efforts, shieldings and things of that nature, and different materials and barriers that you can engineer. Yucca, for example, is not a salt-based repository, Yucca Mountain in Nevada.
Yeah, can you update us a little bit on that? Do you know where where they're at with that? Because my understanding was they had constructed that site to take on a lot of this nuclear waste, or nuclear waste in general. And last I'd heard, I had thought that basically they were kind of walking that back a little bit, like they might not.
I don't think that they ever placed any waste in there at all.
Okay.
There is a act of Congress called the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, and I think basically they more or less decided that Yucca Mountain would be the site for permanent waste storage. And lo and behold, the citizens of Nevada, said no. Basically, there's a lot of opposition, and of course, Harry Reid held a high position at Congress, and so they inhibited and prohibited that development. So it really hasn't been licensed as a waste repository. What's happened recently is that the Trump administration has put in their budget, I think it's $120 million, to try to jumpstart that licensing process again. And it's just this week that Rick Perry, who's the Department of Energy head, he visited the Yucca Mountain site.
Oh, okay. So it's very back in the news recently.
Right. So I think they are pushing it. I'm not sure exactly why now, for instance, with regard to Yucca Mountain. There are sites in different states that want their nuclear waste removed. And in particular, there are nuclear power plants that have shut down, but the waste doesn't go anywhere because there's nowhere to put it. And so that's the big challenge here, is that I think everybody wants some kind of solution, but politically it's a tricky thing to figure out.
Yeah, I imagine that it's every step of the way between like right now, my understanding is there's so much of this waste that's just scattered at every power plant, and they're just, parking it out back, basically, until they can find a place to take it, and then even transporting it, you're going to run into not in my backyard kind of issues.
Right, and so, NIMBY issues, and I also say banana, build absolutely anywhere near anybody. So that's the other acronym that I like to use. But, that holds true for transmission lines. And wind power has had that issue too, and solar farms have had that issue too. Any kind of energy development, these days, we want dessert. We want the full meal and plus dessert, but we don't want to clean up. We don't want to do the hard part about cleaning up after ourselves and making sure the kitchen is nice and stuff like that. So it's a challenge because nobody wants the end product. Everybody wants nice clean energy and as much of it as you want anytime that you want it. It affects nuclear more, but it doesn't. It's not the case that it doesn't affect other sources of energy.
Yeah, that's true, because you look at like wind power, and I remember fights even like where I grew up in more rural South Dakota over like where transmission lines would go and where you could build them and things like that.
And that's just part of it is just the look of the wind turbines sometimes, and some of it is the way that they sound or what have you. So that's a challenge, and I think eventually we're going to have more wind and solar. There's no doubt about that. The question really comes down to how much carbon do you want to go with that? Because today we don't have a good energy storage solution, so we have to burn natural gas or coal or something else to make up the difference. And so I'm a big advocate of developing the small nuclear plants that can load follow, so you don't have to emit carbon while you have your wind and solar.
So using nuclear as the gap generators or the gap plants is
correct. Today's nuclear power plants do load follow a little bit. Natural gas just does it much better. Yeah. And economically, today's nuclear, I would say it doesn't make them money, but they end up losing less money when they load follow, if that makes any sense. And so all this stuff about waste storage for nuclear, that kind of development doesn't happen unless they have a good answer to what are they doing with the waste that they've already generated.
Just out of curiosity, I know there's other countries that have embraced that nuclear energy technology more. What have they been doing with their waste, or do you know anything about that?
Well, I think they are investigating the same kinds of things. I think, is it Sweden or Finland? I think they may have, a waste facility. We do have a waste facility in the United States. That's the waste isolation pilot plant. But that's not for commercial waste. That's more for defense waste and things like, there was a spill at the lab and I used a mop and I, cleaned up the mess with the mop and now I'm disposing of the mop. It's not the getting rid of the fuel and isolating the fuel. So I think more or less today, standard practice across the globe is really this dry cask storage, where basically they put the fuel in a big swimming pool for a certain amount of time, maybe a year, maybe a couple years, until the isotopes like the cesium-137, the things that have a high amount of radioactivity, have some time to decay away, and then they just surround it with concrete and let it air cool. So it's expensive. It's an expensive solution. It takes up space. The utilities relatively recently won a lawsuit against the government because I think since the Waste Policy Act, they have been collecting a fee in order to do the waste storage. And because the government didn't come through with something like Yucca Mountain, they won the lawsuit, so they don't have to keep collecting that fee. And so DOE and the government in general is liable for some of the waste issues that are occurring at the moment, which means basically that we're liable because
yep.
We are the government. So
the taxpayers are on the hook.
Right, exactly. So, and there are other things that I would rather spend our money on. I think the solution is technically possible, but politically very tricky. It's hard to find a solution where everybody agrees that there's enough in it for them to move it forward. So I can get all the engineers and all the scientists, and we can reconfigure designs and everything like that. But whether that's politically palatable, that's unclear.
But the main point for what's going on in South Dakota right now, that was like our catalyst for having the conversation, more they just want to do scientific research on the possibility of storing it somewhere with this technology, is kind of my understanding.
Right. So, and this would once again be for wastes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 that are already in these prepackaged capsules that would fit into a certain size borehole. Commercial nuclear waste does not fit in a 8-inch or 17-inch hole. You can't put it in there. So really we're talking about like less than 1% of the total waste that's out there.
Oh, wow.
So that's kind of a misconception that to say nuclear and there's this big umbrella for all of nuclear waste. And really, because this is the same waste that is stored in these dry concrete casks. And if you've ever seen them, they're basically like as big as a tractor trailer. And so that's not fitting down that 8-inch borehole.
Yeah.
So it's the real technical challenge is, for this first round is, can they drill deep enough and straight enough? And along the way, they will collect some information about what happens in the rock that they've just cored, take some samples, and it's not a full characterization, but they'll take some studies and do some preliminary analysis. But if they can't drill straight enough, then the capsule is going to get stuck midway. And if it gets stuck, how do you get it out? Yeah,
that could be a mess.
Right, and so you have to be able to prove to people that you know what you are doing, and you can do it right the first time. And in part, that's also why they're starting with the simplest geology that they can find. So South Dakota's geology is great. The granite is it's more uniform, but I think at the end of the day, where they will actually store the stuff is closer to where it is now, just to ameliorate transportation issues, which means that you have to drill through more complicated geology. And so how do you get from there to here? Well, you drill in the basic geology, then more complicated, and then you ultimately drill where you're going to store it.
You learn the technique.
Exactly. So, there's some things in general that they already know a lot about with regard to deep borehole drilling, but there's other things that they need to show DOE that they can do. In particular, defense in depth. So when they actually store something, can you prove that the radioisotopes will stay down there for, let's say if it's a 30-year half-life, you want to stay down there for 10 half-lives, so that's 300 years. Not get into any groundwater, not go back up the borehole, not cause any problems with materials down there. Some materials are just going to fail, and you have to expect that. That's why you have what I call defense in depth, multiple barriers. So if one thing fails, and something else backs it up. And they're not even close to that yet.
Yeah.
They're just focusing on the drilling.
Yeah, there's a lot of technical challenges to go along with this.
Yeah, so they are not, as far as I know, they are not going to drop a dummy vessel down one of these boreholes. They'll have something on the drill head that can take some samples and take some data. and stuff like that. But, there's a whole other thing about actually, health physics, radiation safety for people that actually would work with the materials. How do you make sure that those people don't get a dose while you put the vessel into the borehole? That part is not being studied in this first round.
Thank you very much, Professor McTaggart, for giving us a little insight on what's going on with these experiments and some of the policy and the backstory on a lot of this that's going on. And thank you very much for talking with us today.
Well, thank you very much.